We are live.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's conference and symposium. I'm very excited to provide some opening remarks and to join you all for a fascinating discussion today. My name is Dr. Abbas Barzagar. I'm located here in Medina Institute in Atlanta, and I'm very pleased to be with you. I just wanted to give a little bit of framing and discussion in addition to express our gratitude to have you today. And the framing of the discussion for today's conversation is around leadership and education, or education and leadership. And I'd like to sort of preface the comments a little bit in the sense of, what is this symposium about? Why is it that we're bringing these conversations together right now? And how does it fit into our history? So let me go ahead and start, from the current and then go back, inshallah. And in about 10 minutes or so, we can get started with the program. So, as you know, in the contemporary moment, Muslims all over the world, it doesn't matter if you're a minority community in a Western country or, a developing country, if you're a minority community, or whether you're coming from a Muslim majority, country. For over about 150, almost 200 years now, Muslim thinkers around the world have grappled with the problem of education and having to think about educational systems in the modern world with the advancement of the industrial age, with modern technologies, with the modern state system. How is it that we implement institutions of learning and communities of nurturing to both advance our spiritual state, as well as advance sort of the modern conditions and the modern needs of producing livelihood, economic well-being, security, and overall human flourishing? This question is not simply a Muslim question, but it's one that all societies deal with. And if you go into any context around the world, you'll find that the debates around national education or community education really are at the core of social cultural problems. For those of you in the United States right now, for example, if you're familiar with the US context, there is a huge uproar about curriculum in public schools and how much right do parents have to determine the curriculum of public schools, given that there are certain subjects that more conservative folks and people from traditional religious backgrounds will not deem appropriate for a young age. And so again, education is a constant flashpoint. And in the Muslim world, this has been a dual challenge, because on one hand, education has been this spiritual foundation for our ummah. Education is at the core of our Muslim identity. For centuries and centuries, Muslims have celebrated and really honored the tradition of learning. It is an intrinsic part of our deen. It is not simply an auxiliary component. Actually, learning is a part of ibadah and a kind of core piece of ibadah, tafhim, to really understand, tafakkur, to have, reflection. These are things that are core to our essence, core to our identity. And so on one hand, Muslims in the modern world have been challenged to think about how is it that our educational systems can nourish our soul and our purpose as Muslims in the world. But on the other hand, the dual challenge has been, how is it that in the wake of global transformations, whether it's capitalism, colonialism, the modern state system, the rise of secular autocrats within the Muslim world, in face of all of these challenges, how is it that we manage a pragmatic educational approach to deal just with dunya affairs? And of course, there's no reason to diminish the role of the dunya in terms of the things that we have to do to provide livelihood, because we can't support our spiritual growth in our spiritual world if we don't have a grasp upon the resources and assets and blessings, the ni'mah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, the rizq that he's given us. So how is it that we maintain these pragmatic studies and also these theological studies? And what you find in the Muslim world is, frankly, that there's been a bifurcation, that the ulama, the traditional religious sciences, and the, let's say, pragmatic educational arts have been completely separated. And not only have they been separated from an educational point of view, even socially and culturally, they're treated as two different spheres. And so we have a kind of problem within our communities and within our societies where this separation in education, has reverberations within the way that our class is structured, the way our social classes are structured, the way that our communities are structured. Not only that, but the religious communities often have been insulated, have been isolated, and frankly have been very defensive about the way in which they will approach and engage, education. And so what you see is, a comment for the last 200 years and a kind of stagnation around education on the spiritual and practical level within the Muslim world. At Medina Institute USA, it's this bifurcation and it's this separation that we've always challenged head on. And it's this stagnation that we've challenged head on. And so, alhamdulillah, it's wonderful to be part of a community in which the revival of Islam is attached to reason, is attached to heritage, is attached to open-minded thinking and rigorous engagement with scholarship. And so today's symposium is intended to bring some of that conversation to the fore. Oftentimes in our religious communities, we emphasize, naturally, the spiritual development of our communities. And so many of us, we come to Medina Institute and to our masajid, alhamdulillah, and to our shuyukh and our, and our ustads and ustadas. We come to them for that spiritual nourishment, a kind of escape in some ways from the dunya. And alhamdulillah, it has that place. But it is also the case that Medina Institute is a place of rigorous learning, rigorous education. And oftentimes in the public space, people don't get to see this face of Medina Institute and our affiliates and our scholars and our students. And we have a tremendous network of very, very learned people around the world, alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they've been brought together from different backgrounds, different trainings, to be able to share with you some of the things that they're doing that both revive our Islamic tradition, as well as bridge the gap to the practical, to the implementable everyday life, to the community life, to make sure that we're doing things in such a way that they will benefit the community. Speaking historically, it is precisely this kind of lack of bifurcation, it is this integration that we see, or at least we dream of in the Islamic past. I'm sure that if we were to fly back in time, I'm sure that some of the scenes that we imagine aren't as rosy and picturesque as we imagine them to be. But there is an ideal there, and there is a reality there that we can touch and feel and we can see. And I want to share with you one of our I would say, one of Medina Institute's connections to this historical tradition. Behind me, you'll see this bridge, right? This bridge is from a small city. It's a quaint city in Andalusia called Randa. Okay, Randa, and it is a city that is basically the first kind of hill when you're entering into Andalusia from Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. Okay, so as you're entering Andalusia, before you get into the amazing landscape and the cities and everything, like just a little bit into the hinterland, this is the first major fort. It's got a fascinating history. There's Greek ruins there, there's Roman ruins there, and then of course the Muslims came and set up fort there. And then of course after the Reconquista, if you want to call it that, there's now a Christian legacy in the city. But one of the most exemplary scholars of the Islamic tradition hails from this city. His name was Ibn Abad Arundi, okay? Ibn Abad from Aranda, okay? And he hails from this city, and it was a city of remarkable learning of Islamic scholars. And what was fascinating about this approach and the kind of approach of Ibn Abad is that he corresponded with many of his colleagues around the world from this location as a minority, in this kind of Andalusian context, but also with his Christian counterparts, and engaged many different kinds of discourses. And the letters that he produced, the Risa'il of Ibn Abad, just the discourses between him and his students, demonstrate a rigorous methodological commitment to the Quran and the Sunnah, with a constant realization of the ma'rifah that lies behind the ilm. And this was a fascinating approach, because up until this point, you had very rigorous jurisprudential scholars that were kind of separated from the ma'rifah, and then you had Sufi scholars that were maybe a little too far into the Ma'rifah, lost the texts. But Ibn Abbad begins to integrate these issues and provides a very rationalist, dependable, methodologically sound approach to the Quran and the Sunnah that really captivates, I think, in many ways, the spirit of what Medina Institute is also trying to do in the way that we approach this subject. Ibn Abbad is, then moved to Fez and is buried there today. But his tradition represents, I believe, this kind of cosmopolitan, rationalist, but also very, very strong Ihsani tradition within education. And it is that kind of educational approach that I think Medina Institute brings to the table. And today we hope to showcase that in the sense that we want to talk about both the pragmatic as well as the spiritual, see them integrated, and really make a different impression upon what is what is the role of education and leadership for our communities today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to our, I don't know if I should go to Asad, excuse me, or to directly to Yahya in order to get us started for today's program. But we do have, 2 panel discussions, and then we will have a roundtable discussion where we will come back and explore some of these themes in a larger way. And then, alhamdulillah, we will also have our beloved Shaykh come back with us in the afternoon for some closing comments. And so thank you all for joining us. We look forward to your engagement, to your questions, your comments, and inshallah, we have a wonderful morning together. Sidi Yahya, I'll hand it over to you for our first panel.
All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much, Dr. Abbas, for the wonderful introduction. That is truly what we're trying to do at Medina Institute, integrate both the Ma'rifah and the text, because true Ma'rifah can only come out of a rigorous and true understanding of the Quran and Sunnah. So just to kind of reboot what we're going to do right now, first of all, we're going to introduce individual speakers, then open the presentations of the individual speakers on the topic of the Muslim family and the intersection with education. This is related again to what we're talking about with Dr. Abbas Barzgar. So, and then if I have enough time, I'm going to ask a couple of questions of my own and then open up to Q&A. But anybody who has questions, please feel free to send them over, and then inshallah we're going to be asking them to the speakers. All right, bismillah. We will first start with Dr. Intisar Itabaiga. Dr. Intisar Itabaiga was born and raised in Libya. She did her university degree in the English language, at Al-Tahadi University in 2006. She was awarded her master's degree in translation studies from Arabic to English and from English to Arabic at the Libyan Academy. She studied at the University of the Western Cape and did her PhD there, which she completed in 2018 in the field of additional language teaching and learning. She worked in education faculty at the University of Western Cape from 2018 to 2020, and she has been actively engaged and presented at a number of local and international conferences and seminars. She represented the University of the Western Cape at the workshops and themes such as teaching Arabic as a foreign language and the ESRRRC conference, which focuses on master's and PhD students' research. Dr. Intisar has enrolled in many courses related to her professional development, including but not limited to online teaching, Microsoft Office, and teaching e-portfolio. Her teaching philosophy is critical pedagogy and that each student can reach their full potential on their own way. Dr. Intisar is a full-time lecturer of Arabic at Medina Institute, South Africa. Now we will play her presentation.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Our paper is entitled Tazkiyatun Nafs and Ihsan as a Teaching and Learning Philosophy. In most higher education institutions, Western values, Eurocentric knowledge, and teaching philosophies have epistemic hegemony. And therefore, scholars have called for the decolonization and rethinking of Western educational values and reformulating the pedagogic culture of higher education. So pedagogy continues to instrumentalize knowledge and envisages the teaching learning event as a banking transaction where knowledge is deposited into the heads of students. And of course, this is not the case with the prophetic tradition, which regards teaching as a prophetic vocation, where the teaching learning event is an interaction aimed at improving students' character. Ihsan, which is translated as spiritual excellence, is a state of God consciousness displayed in good character. So this paper actually draws on the prophetic concept of Ihsan as a philosophy that informs the whole edifice of life, including education. And of course, extending Ihsan to higher education implies the development of God consciousness within both the teacher and the student. Next, please. This paper, in fact, aims at offering a new teaching philosophy that takes its inspiration from Ihsan to enhance teacher and student character development, which Muslims unfortunately have not yet sufficiently explained how it can be utilized as a teaching philosophy and practice. Next, please. So therefore, the research question this study tries to answer is how Ihsan can be translated into a teaching philosophy and practice that promotes teacher and student character development. Scholars have indicated that Western pedagogic practice do not take into, or practices do not really take into account the influence of character in the teaching process. And this means that the primary focus is merely on transferring the decontextualized core curriculum and ensuring students' academic performance. And this is what highlights, or this is the gap that we are trying to bridge in this study. Next, please. So in terms of methodology, this is a theoretical paper drawing from the written genre of Tazkiyatun Nafs, which means in English, purification of the self, which is the means to Ihsan. Next, please. The conventional Western teaching theory and practice tends to divorce teaching from moral behavior. But Islam, on the other hand, encourages the combination of moral behavior and knowledge acquisition, and thus emulating the virtues of the Prophet is the greatest value in Islamic education. The Quran knowledge purify themselves inwardly to reach the state of Ihsan, which is, of course, the highest level of spiritual development. So getting to the state of Ihsan means engaging in the purification of the self, and this compromises practices that foster character development and the attainment of adab, which is a state where the results of the inner purification is seen within one's character. Next, please. So when it comes to Tazkiyatun Nafs, linguistically, Tazkiyah means the removal of impurities, and it also means growth. As far as nafs is concerned, the nafs is refers to the self. In this paper, we use the term tazkiyah as the effort that a person does to address the moral impurities in him or herself. And tazkiyah is also pursued as a long life mission that can be derived from the Quranic injunctions. And my colleague Abdullah will take it from here, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. Higher education institutions play a critical role in shaping their students' relationships with themselves, with each other, and the communities. In that, when a student passes through an institution, he or she gains skills. But unfortunately, most of the time, the skills are either research skills or professional development. Therefore, many scholars have called for universities to take an active role in character development. We propose that tazkiyatun nafs and ihsan are key Islamic elements for bringing about a character development pedagogy. Our concluding remarks: tazkiyah and ihsan can be utilized within a character building pedagogy with the aim of bringing divine awareness and self-purification to students and to teachers. Most importantly, teachers. We see that if tazkiyatun nafs and ihsan are utilized by teachers as a teaching philosophy, then we will see character development in teachers and in students. Jazakumullah khair.
All right, Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Intisar Atbega. Next, we have Dr. Ahmed Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed is an Arabic lecturer at Georgia Tech. He completed his PhD in language and literacy from Georgia State University. He currently teaches the beginning level of Arabic, and he also taught Arabic at Georgia State University for about 2 years. His research interest is in intercultural communication, transnationalism, Arab and Muslim identity as they intersect with American identity, and teaching Arabic as a foreign or heritage language. Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. We will play your presentation right now.
Of identity for my Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ahmed Ahmed, and my presentation is about the identity development of Muslim youth in America. I hope this presentation could help parents, educators, or anyone who interacts with our Muslim youth to have a better understanding of what our youth might be going through. The table that you see in front of you is based on the cultural theory that is developed by Su and Su, and they suggest that there are 5 stages for the development of identity for minorities. And the stages are conformity, dissonance, resistance, introspection, and finally, integrative awareness. I would like to point out that by suggesting there are 5 stages, that doesn't mean that everyone has to go through all the stages in order, or suggesting a specific time frame or period of time for each stage. However, someone might go through 3 of them, or not exactly go in order by the first one and then the second one. So people are different in going through these stages and different in terms of how long they stay in one stage versus the other. So the first stage here that we have conformity, and that's when a person holds positive attitude towards the dominant group, or they prefer the dominant cultural group versus their own ethnic group, or their own group that they belong to, and they might value their characteristics, and they want to identify with the dominant group. After that stage, they move on to dissonance, where they start to question this position and question the fact that they prefer the dominant group versus their own group. And then they start moving away from seeing the dominant culture groups as all good, and they start to see, like, realize that actually there is some racism, or there is some characteristics that are not that great. And they start to develop a sense of growing sense of owns their own culture heritage, and they will start to appreciate that. So that's the second stage. Moving to the third stage, they start to embrace or hold positive attitudes towards their own race and their own cultural heritage and ethnic group. Um, they will also start to reject some of the dominant values of society and culture, and they would like to help people from their own culture group, and they might show some distrust or anger towards the dominant cultural group. In the fourth stage, they begin to question the cost of having strong feelings toward dominant cultural groups, and then they want to refocus their energy and their attention on their own personal identity while respecting cultural groups. And they start to recognize that not all aspects of dominant culture group or any other group, including their own racial cultural group, they recognize that not everything is good or not everything is bad. So they start to focus more on their own self-identity and recognizing that all cultural groups can just be all good or all bad. Finally, in the final stage, they start to develop a secure, confident sense of identity. They're proud of their identity. They don't feel ashamed or they feel like I don't belong to this group. They're proud, they're confident, they become multicultural, um, and they also commit to supporting other diverse groups or oppressed groups. So they shift from not only that they're proud of their own identity and they're helping their own group, they're also becoming more multicultural and they want to support and help other diverse groups as well. And this is basically the most important stage out of all of them when somebody reached that stage. From my own experience with students and working with them and interviewing some of them, doing research with students about identity, here are a few statements from students that represent some of the stages that we mentioned. For example, someone saying, I didn't want them to know that I'm Muslim, or I decided not to tell them where my parents are from. And that reminds us of the first stage where they don't want to belong to their own group. They don't want people to know they belong to this group if they can, unless there is no way to hide that. And then when they finally reach the final stage, when they start to say, oh, I think I'm a mix of the two cultures. I like the mix because you can take the best of each culture. And that's when they become transnational. They're part of two cultures and they appreciate the good things in each culture. I hope by knowing these stages, we can have a better understanding of what our youth or our kids are going through. And if we see them in the first stage or second stage, not accepting their own culture group, we can understand that eventually they will come to the integrative awareness stage and be proud of their own identity and be confident and secure in that. Here are two books that I could recommend if you want to read more about this topic. These are also three books that you could check out if you want, especially the last one about Out of Place by Edward Said. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Wassalamu alaikum.
All right, Jazakumullah khair to both of our presenters. These were fantastic presentations. I do have questions now. So I will start with Dr. Intisar Etbayga. So is tazkiyah and character development equally important for pedagogy in elementary education as in secondary education? I think that's a very interesting question.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks for the question. And I believe that it is indeed as important for both phases, the elementary as well as the high school. Because remember, when you are talking about kids, this is the time when you are laying the foundation. So the better the foundation, this means that it will make it even easier for you to tackle these aspects of character development when it comes to higher education. So character development cannot be restricted or a topic that can only be spoken about or an issue that can be raised when it comes to higher education, because the life of the person cannot be divided or separated. So it's fine for you to not to work on your character unless or until you start your higher education. So the concept, the reason why we are focusing on higher education, it's that we can see that the higher education context or institutions basically are becoming, unfortunately, market driven, where the focus is merely on professional development and research, and they tend to ignore the importance or the significance of character development. And this is why I believe we sit with this dilemma with the graduates who only sit with degrees but not really sort of deceived, and they still don't know how to behave or take basically the responsibility that they should be held accountable towards building the communities. And this is what contributes to the dilemma that we are facing.
Thank you so much for your answer. That definitely makes sense. Dr. Ahmed, I was wondering, so it seems that most Muslim Americans, at least from my experience, and I could be mistaken about this, but it seems that most of them do not fully experience the introspection stage, becoming excessively critical of their own heritage, being critical of the Muslim tradition, or being excessively critical of the Western tradition. So what are the barriers from realizing the introspection stage? Because it seems that that's a very important stage to move forward.
So from my understanding of this theory, that you might not go through all the stages. So it doesn't necessarily suggest that everyone will start with the first stage. So these are stages that possibly you might go through some of them. And it could be very short, that you might not notice it as a community, but someone might reflect on that on their own and might not say it publicly. So it depends on the person. From my own research and talking to students and reflecting on their own identity development, what is very obvious is the first stage and the last stage. That is very clear. And the statements that I shared, they're not from 4 different people, but they're from like 2, the first one and the last one from the same person. So saying like, okay, this is how I used to be and this is what I was doing, but now I'm in this position now that I'm proud of my identity, and not proud in a way that everything is right within my group and everything is wrong on the other group, but like I'm proud, I recognize my own identity, but also I know there are a lot of good things in other different groups, and they accept the fact that they're part of 2 groups, not just 1. So it might not be clear with everyone, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. All right, Dr. Etbayga, I was wondering, so somebody may, I'm going to play devil's advocate, and somebody might say that, how, perhaps it's clear how tazkiyah and character development is important for the transmission of knowledge when it comes to philosophy, right? Because if we have proper ethics, perhaps we will more easily reach truth, or we will reach the correct truths because perhaps our own psyche or heart will have challenges reaching truth if we don't have proper ethics. But how do you think that character development affects the transmission of knowledge in the physical sciences? I think, by the way, I think you're making a fantastic and incredibly profound point, but I would love, the audience to hear how this is actually important in all fields, not necessarily just in, philosophy.
Okay, that's actually a good question. So, okay, I will do my best to answer it. So basically, when you are talking about transferring knowledge, and regardless of the field, and for there should everything should always be driven by the ethics. So what you need to do is that you need to apply these work ethics regardless of what is your specialization or what your field is. So if you are talking about physical science, for example, not just necessarily philosophy. So if you don't have this character development, how are you going to maintain that what you are providing or the knowledge that you are sharing, it's actually for the best of the community? So the whole point is that providing or working for the concept of the public good. So this should be the driving point or the driving concept when you are talking about physical science or philosophy, and this is actually what needs to be built on. Because if you are talking about if you are talking about maybe doctors, if you are talking about engineers, if you are talking about these kinds of specialization, how will you ensure that the work ethics, when it comes, I'm just giving you like simple examples, how will you ensure that if you have a doctor, that these people will apply the concept of ihsan or the concept of tazkiyatun nafs in terms of confidentiality, so that not exposing the whatever your patients are sharing with you, in terms of showing this ethics of care, basically in terms of not being money driven, and this is that is wide, like really spreading. Even medicine and engineering and all these are becoming sort of removed. We are removing the human aspect of these professions. So we are just focusing on doctors or medicine being like a profession, regardless of being a humanitarian mission where you focus on saving the lives of people. Now, because of the way we teach, it's becoming, and the philosophies that we adopt, which are far from ihsan and tazkiyatun nafs, now we focus on what? We are just focusing on the needs of the market. So we are becoming market driven. Basically, I want to specialize in this profession, not really because I care or I want to provide the best service to the community and become like a good member in my community or in my society. I'm only choosing this because I care about how much I will earn at the end of the day. So everything is, we are removing the moral values of these professions, even though they are supposed to be all based on ihsan and tazkiyatun nafs. I hope this answers your question.
No, that's a very profound. I think that's also a criticism of the secularization of education by and large, and the possible consequences, the long-term consequences of secularization of values and so on. Thank you so much. Dr. Ahmed, I was wondering, do you reach the fifth stage, the final stage? Would it be different for somebody who went through all the stages as opposed to somebody who might have skipped the stages? Because I can imagine, or I think I have met people who are potentially in the fifth stage, but may still have some maybe immature attitudes towards the integration aspect, like both being introspective and being able to recognize both the faults and the virtues of different parts of their own identity?
I think this is a very good question, because if you perhaps skip the third stage and just move to the fifth one, where you feel confident and secure and proud, skipping the third stage might be a result of the anger and distrust that you feel, and then you completely move towards, like, I'm confident, proud, but everything is right within my group. There's nothing wrong. There's no fault, as you mentioned. And this could maybe take the person back to the third stage and then back to the fifth. So basically, we should remember that there's no specific exact order that everyone should go through. And maybe someone will move from the first one to the fifth one, but then they might go back and move through the stages, and that would give like a complete idea and being like, okay, I know I belong to this group, I know I belong to this society, and I'm just enjoying the best of every group and every aspect of both groups. As it's not easy to reach the last stage or the final stage. I don't want to call it the last or the final, but the integrative awareness. But I notice when students reach that, the way they describe it as, like, I heard the word mix from many students. I'm a mix of both cultures. I'm both. I'm this and that. I'm not this or that. And I like that. So when they reach that stage, they feel like, yes, I'm both, and I like that. So I hope that helped.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. We have 4 minutes left, so I'll have two more questions for both of you. So one more question for both of you, sorry. But I'd like us to be as brief as possible, just so that we can fit in. And so if it's way too, I guess, complex of a question, please let me know and I can try to simplify it. So Dr. Tabayra, I was wondering, how do we integrate tazkiyah or character development in a secular context? I know this is a very complex question, but somebody might say that as a result of living in a very pluralistic society, multicultural society, it's going to be difficult to agree on what what virtues to instill in people.
Okay, that's another good question. So in our presentation, we mentioned that the gap that we are trying to bridge is that Muslims did not actually haven't really or successfully managed to explain how this whole concept of ihsan and tazkiyatun nafs can be translated as a teaching philosophy. So if we are talking about integrating ihsan and tazkiyatun nafs, which are Islamic concepts, to the secular sector, then it should be presented as a teaching philosophy. Let me just give you an example. So I've been looking at different teaching philosophies like ethics of care, social constructivism, scaffolding, critical pedagogy, all these theories or teaching philosophies. Each one actually focuses on one specific aspect and not tend to ignore, but the main focus is only one aspect of the teaching and learning, the whole teaching and learning process. If we consider the concept of ihsan and tazkiyatun nafs, all these concepts are all actually covered within one concept that was given or provided to us from the Islamic teaching. So we have ethics of care, all these aspects that comes or pertains to teaching and learning, such as starting from setting your lessons, your classroom, your assessment, the way you give your feedback. If we go back to the teachings of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, everything was actually given and explained to us that can be taken as a teaching philosophy that should be implemented in our classrooms. And then we can advocate as Muslims to this teaching philosophy to be introduced also in the secular system, not from an Islamic perspective, but also from a humanitarian, or if we take it as a human or humanitarian concept that maintains the rights of humans or students as well as teachers that are the main components of the teaching process.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I appreciate it. That's a great answer. So, Dr. Ahmed, I was wondering, so it's in Pew Research poll, they showed, I think this was in 2016, that 20 to 25% of Muslim Americans who are born Muslim actually leave Islam by the time they're adults. Of course, this is important. It's important to consider that a lot of the people who leave actually come from secular backgrounds or backgrounds with non-practicing parents, but it's still a very large number. It's also true that the number of Muslims in America is not being reduced as a result of the high number of converts or reverts who enter Islam, which compensates for the reduction from people who leave Islam in the United States. But I was wondering if the theory of stages has any, like, why you think that a lot of people do leave Islam, and whether you think that the theory of stages can give us some insight about, number one, why this happens and what can be done in order to reduce this unfortunate phenomenon.
Yes, as you said, that's a complex question. So I don't think I can really answer specifically to why some people leave Islam, but because that theory is not really about religion specifically. So it's basically about minority groups living within a society that there's a dominant group that is different from their own group. So I would say maybe a very important factor here is how parents, community, and their own circle interacts with them and reacts to what they're saying or what they're doing in specific stages. For example, if you see me in the first stage and I don't really want to feel like I identify with my group, whether maybe it's my cultural group where I came from, not specifically religion, but parents or friends or my own circle might see this as I'm rejecting religion, and maybe they don't like that. So maybe the reaction is taking me a little bit away or confirming that, you see, this is why these are the things that I don't like. So I don't want to say that this is the reason or have specific reasons, because that's not something that I studied. So this is basically on cultural identity. And that theory is generally speaking about minority groups.
I see. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both of our speakers. We really appreciate your presentations, and these are great, paths to take. And we need more Muslims to try to pick up this challenge to understand how we can offer better prescriptions for Muslim educators and Muslims who are leading families and teaching children how to become better Muslims in a minority context, which most of us here are minorities, if not all of us. Next, we're going to have a roundtable. Dr. Abbas, would you like to continue? Bismillah.
All right, assalamu alaikum, everybody. It was a great discussion. I was really happy to hear some of the concepts come out from, there's some very great critical, teachers and thinkers out there, and I hope we can talk more about them. And I want to invite the roundtable to everybody. We'll get started today. We'll get started now with you, Sidi Yahya, and Dr. Broddard to begin this discussion. But I'm also excited that we have people here that can also jump in. So please feel free to have this as an open discussion. But I was mentioning that I was really happy to hear about the critical pedagogists like Paulo Freire's ideas about the banking system of education. It's really critical. I just happened to teach this a couple of weeks ago in my own course that we teach around Muslim humanitarianism. You actually teach a course in the summer around Muslim humanitarianism, alhamdulillah, at Indiana University. So I want to go ahead and get started with you, Sidi Yahya, and you, Sidi Dr. Broddard, about some just kind of top level conversations here. I began to allude to some of the ideals of Islamic education that we have in our history and some of the concepts around that. And oftentimes I think about the etymology of some of our words and some of the kind of meanings that are captured within some of our words around education. So I wanted to posit basically two words or theoretical fields of education. And one is ta'lim and one is tarbiyah. And so ta'lim, for, you know, for those, you know, who are listening, is maybe in English translated best as didactic education. It's kind of transmission of ilm. It is to teach in that very sort of very concrete transfer of knowledge type of sense. But tarbiyah means something a little bit different. And it could be, it's within the realm of education. It's nurturing, it's caring, it's curating. I have my own thoughts on this, but I wanted to get your guys' opinion on, you know, what you think these two concepts mean for us today, and how you think they might relate to the, you know, the topic of leadership. And Dr. Brodad, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dr. Abbas, thanks a lot for the question. Thanks to all the organizers who invited me. I'm very happy to be with you. And indeed, I think that's a crucial question, very interesting one, with a lot of misunderstanding maybe. So let me start by, my viewpoint is that it's very linked to epistemology, what we can call Islamic epistemology. And in my view, ta'lim or ta'lum, because it depends who we are, yes? And tazkiyah, I would take tarbiyah with tazkiyah together here, even if it's slightly different, but in this kind of idea, I think to make my point, I can take both of the concepts together. In my perspective, they cannot be divided in an Islamic epistemology. But it's important to note that what we see in Islamic institutions don't reflect Islamic epistemology most of the time, because we hadn't had a reflection of what Islamic epistemology really means in most cases. So in Islamic epistemology, ta'lim needs tazkiyah, needs tarbiyah, because we need to have light in the heart in order to understand what makes sense, to understand the priorities of Islam, for instance, or purpose of life, the maqasid, and the principles, the usul. So I wouldn't divide in the Islamic approach both of that. But that said, it's important to say that in many Islamic institutes, I could visit mostly, I mean, both in the Muslim countries or non-Muslim countries, they neglect this Islamic epistemology by having a more Western-based approach to knowledge, where they divide both, and they think ta'lim is knowledge that everyone can acquire through studies, and tarbiyah is another thing. You do that for yourself, maybe in another space. And I think it's an important mistake, because that leads to many crises today in such institutions. The crisis of authority first, because we don't know who we can listen to anymore, and any kind of scholars is questioned. And then we have this crisis of authority linked to the crisis of knowledge, of course, because knowledge is not clear anymore. If we just have this rational approach to Islam, I think that we're open to a lot of debates and misunderstandings and also conflicts. But that said, also, I think that the solution would be to bring back both concepts together, which is a very challenging proposition. Of course, it cannot be like done like that, but at least to consider what are beyond our perceptions of knowledge, our purpose of education. You know, at least we have to open the debate. And now to connect the question with the role of the leader, I think if we understand the link between ta'lim and tarbiyah or tazkiyah, it's very crucial to note that the leader must incorporate the teaching. He must act in accordance to what he teaches, because in a lot of time, We can see teachers that have knowledge, external knowledge, but maybe they act in the life in the opposite way of what they teach. And this trigger to a crisis in education, because students may have doubts about the correctness or the meaning of what they've learned. If they see that the leader, the educator, the teacher just act in contradiction with what he teaches. So I think that all these points are going together quite in a circle when we start and end up with the epistemology concerns, as the previous speakers have highlighted these points just before. I don't want to be long, but that's my few observations here.
No, Jazakallah khair. That was excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing that together. Sidi Yahya, I'd like to go ahead and put that question back to you. You know, how do these concepts for you, tarbiyah, ta'aleem, and if you'd like to bring in tazkiyah as well, how do they, you know, what do they mean to you? And then also, you know, how do you consider them to be related to the question of leadership?
I think Dr. Brodard's answer was fantastic, and I find it very difficult to add something to it. But I will speak from an area where I have some, because I'm not an expert when it comes to education or tarbiyah or ta'aleem, even within the Islamic context, but I am trained in the social sciences. And one thing you'll see, and I'll make it make sense. I know now it sounds very abstract, but one thing that is true is that in the Western context, and this is obvious in the social sciences, there is always a desire to find linear causation. So, for example, you see two related concepts and you find a correlation between them. Let's say you run a regression or whatever kind of empirical test to test the relationship between two things. Very often, if there's a correlation, there's a very strong desire to assert that there's a causation relationship between the two. However, very, very often, two things together have a spiral relationship. This is the case in most complex phenomena. So it's actually not possible to assert where the direction of the causation is coming from. And the problem is, again, because we're trying to, let's say, have policy prescriptions for a lot of social scientific phenomena, we jump to conclusions. And when we jump to conclusions and we assert certain things as facts about the relationship between these two things, we very often create a very fickle science, a science that is weak, that is discredited by our reality that we experience, and social science becomes discredited. That's why it has a weaker position as opposed to physical sciences. But this is, I think that this is related to the relationship between ta'allum or ta'aleem as well as tarbiyah. It's very difficult to point which comes first. So on one hand, in order to properly have tarbiyah, you have to have knowledge. All right. If I were to, my spiritual and character refinement requires that I have correct knowledge about what is good and what is bad. All right. And whether this knowledge is a product of intuition or learned matters is a separate matter, but that knowledge must be there, and I must recognize it. So to give you an example, husn al-dhann, having good opinion of others, is an important matter in our ethical teachings, right? And as a matter of tarbiyah. However, having proper knowledge, like for example, having knowledge, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا, the insan is created weak, right? As well as خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ مِنْ عَجَلٍ, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah mentions very clearly in the Quran, in Kitabullah, certain characteristics of human beings. And when I understand this, once I have been taught this, my ability to engage in husn al-dhann, which is or good opinion of others and forgiveness of others, is easier because I have proper knowledge. So the tarbiyah has this the knowledge as a precondition. Simultaneously, and this is a point that Dr. Shaykh Muhammad Ninowy emphasizes, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, Ar-Rahman 'allama al-Quran. The ilm has as a precondition rahmah. So the good ethical foundation is required to properly understand, but also prioritize. right? The good, you can think of it as an ethical skeleton. So both of them are important in a spiral fashion, and spiral complex phenomena don't have a beginning or end. So you can't really pinpoint this is important for this or this is important for this. They're radically correlated. It's like a spiral again. It's a corkscrew relationship. And I think we should pay more attention to spirals in general, whether it's in social science or education or otherwise. Wallahu a'lam.
That was fascinating. Jazakallah khair. That was great. I don't think I've ever heard that concept before of this spiral instead of a linear type of relationship. And it is definitely one of the, kind of drawbacks of this emphasis on empiricism that comes out of the Enlightenment tradition. And to be fair, there's quite a bit that's moved beyond that in philosophy and culture, but still, when it comes to hard sciences, when it comes to kind of our major institutions and the way that we think about things, it is very much the case that that's what matters. Can you draw can you at least act like you're drawing a direct line between the data and the phenomena? And whether or not nobody actually believes it, but if you can make that claim, that's normally what opens up the door. I'd like to go ahead and move on to the second question before we open up the discussion a little bit more. And Dr. Brodard, I'd like to come back to you and ask the question about some of your own work and how it applies to your own work. A lot of your work has focused on kind of social and cultural conflict, especially around issues of identity, Muslims in the West, but also you've had a tremendous amount of experience traveling around the Muslim world and gaining insight into some of our institutions in different contexts. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think some of the critical gaps are that are facing Muslim institutions and our community? Where could we lean in on some of these things? What are the major gaps? If you had all the resources and the magic wand, where would you fill the gaps?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Abbas. Again, I think that this question is crucial, and of course, I cannot pretend to bring a general answer. So let me just speak about my case and my own observations. And I'll start by stating the observation I made in quite a lot of countries, where we see that there are so-called Islamic conferences with high values, principles, and very nice talks, and people agree on what they hear. And then you see the living reality of the Muslims, or the same Muslims who attend the conference, which is totally in contradiction with that. And that's observations a lot of people, I think, we have made in the past till today, which show a huge gap between the education, the content, the norms, the principles we want to implement, and the reality, which year after year is very difficult for a lot of our Muslim brothers and sisters. And I think maybe I just have two reflections based on that observation. I think that, first of all, this gap is between there is a gap because of the difference of the level of discourses of speakers and the level of people living reality of many people, which is totally in contradiction, unfortunately, with Islamic principles. And we see that all over the world, mostly in Muslim countries, everybody can witness that we don't implement collectively the Islamic principles. If not, the world will be a different place, a much better place today. And I think that this gap must be challenged. Why we have so much gap? A good leader should understand people's problem, first of it. He should be aware of the reality of the people, and a wrong perception that Muslim leaders or educators may have is the inability to face the reality in the field and to acknowledge bad things happening. Or when we teach what's halal, what's haram, often we don't want to speak too much about the haram, and then we neglect what people are doing because we don't want to witness it, because it's bad in our eyes, so we prefer to keep that aside. But I think that's the base of the problem is not to acknowledge the situation people live in. It's one thing to teach what's haram, what should be prohibited, what should be avoided. That's very important to do. But at the same time, the only discourse is not the whole solution. First, we have to understand people condition, people situations, and what they act, the way they act. And then it's possible, if we do that, I think, to imagine a solution step by step to change the situation, slowly. But not a lot of people want to do that because of the emotion we can feel behind the awareness of a sad reality we prefer to neglect. But then the danger of that is it's the gap, a huge gap between reality and utopian teaching, utopian thought of what should be, but which is not the case in this world. That I think is not proper in Islamic tradition, and it wasn't made a long time ago. Now we have a lot of this tendency, maybe based on the fact that we want to promote also the value of the Islamic message, but I think we're wrong in the approach, at least in this extent. My second point is also it's interesting to develop critical thought, to develop balanced views, because we must ensure the unity of the group. And we live in a very controversial media coverage, for instance, about the war, about whatever crisis we face, like the COVID crisis, or many examples. And for leaders, often everyone has his own interpretation, of course, but I think it's very crucial here to foster the feeling of unity and to allow critical thought and balanced views at the same time in order to let expression for all of the sides and not to divide the groups in parties which will fight each other. And I speak about that because these last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a lot of these clashes and sad events within Muslim communities, even with the COVID situation and then with the war in Russia and so. So I think disagreement is something very normal, but sometimes we failed to provide safe space that everyone can express his views without being outcasted. Well, I don't want to take too much time. It's just the start of a few reflections, and hopefully there will be comments, discussion regarding that.
No, Jazakallah khair. I really appreciate your first point there, where it was interesting because you said, if I understood you correctly, the gaps that really exist are in terms of our approaches and our perspectives to certain kinds of problems. And so it's not something that can be filled necessarily, but a mindset shift has to change. You know, there has to be a change in mindset in order to address these issues. But I really, really do appreciate this one point that you made about the difference between sort of confronting reality head on and living in a kind of utopian worldview. And you said specifically that this really isn't representative of Islamic tradition. And it's quite the case. You know, my colleagues in Islamic studies, they do a lot of archival research around, you know, in fiqh books and case, you know, and kind of the equivalent of case laws. You know, if you study, for example, just fatwas, the, you know, historical fatawa, if you just study them, the most mundane and the most boring things, all right, there wouldn't even be a controversial or interesting topic. But if you go through the archives and you study these things, you start to learn about the social context in ways that you wouldn't. But what's fascinating, to your point, Dr. Brodad, is that the Muslims did not shy away from confronting the most challenging questions in front of them, because there's a mandate, right? Like you have to, you know, there's a mandate, a Shari'i mandate that supersedes really like all of our text. It's the fact that as Muslims, we have to confront the world, and we have to have the confidence that you know, that our sources, the text and the amal of our community and the precedent of our community and the ijma' of our community and the tradition, that we have the sources to confront any kind of issue that's out there. And instead, what you're talking about is that there's something of a condition now where people bury their heads in the sand and they kind of ignore certain things. And it's a much different spirit than this aggressive, confident sort of approach to dealing with the world and engaging every corner of, you know, of knowledge on the planet at that time, and really taking up that mandate. I consider it a type of, there's almost a kind of wilaya to this, a kind of khalifa to this, you know, like, you know, a certain kind of spirit that I don't think we have much of left these days. It's hard to find, at least. I know that, I'm sorry to continue here, but there's a, you know, a couple of discussion forums I'm involved in, and one recently was engaged in the concept around Islamic economics. I know that's your territory, Sidi Yahya, excuse me, but it was remarkable to see how quickly the discussion divided between the utopian folks and folks who just kept saying it should be like this, should be like this, should be like this, and if we do this, if we do this, if we do this, then this, and the other folks who were saying, you know, no, these are the modern financial economic institutions in the world today. They're mountains, they're giants. You have to engage this, you have to engage that. What are the practical solutions? And there's one group that was just calling for practical solutions, and the other group was just saying, your mindset is wrong, you have to do something different. But they were just really talking to themselves and had no intention. And, you know, it's a pretty remarkable phenomenon to see that happen. This wasn't a local discussion, this was an international discussion, and you know, top scholars around the world. So it was quite telling. So that point that you made resonates with me. Sidi Yahya, I'm going to jump over to you real quick. You know, I'd like to get your perspective as an economist from a purely kind of rational institutional perspective. I'm really looking for something concrete here. Thinking about institutions and scalability, right? You know, because we have a major issue here. Scalability. Where do you think we can invest as a community to optimize our education and leadership capacities in local and international contexts?
Bismillah. I think my answer to this question is generally not in line with most answers I would give from an institutional perspective. I think that the world in general, especially since the 20th century, has presumed or assumed that there are economies of scale, which means high returns to investment when it comes to having larger and larger institutions. But what the latter half of the 20th century has shown in general is that when you create larger institutions, bureaucracy takes over, and that has incredibly high costs and decreases efficiency. So by and large, there are diseconomies of scale to having behemoth institutions, right? However, I do think that there are economies of scale in producing or in trying to invest in administrative bodies when it comes to coordination between Muslim organizations of different stripes and colors in the West. I also, or in wherever they're minorities. I also think that there are plenty of economies of scale when it comes to, which means high returns to investment and high rates of efficiency that we can capture, or getting closer to perfect efficiency. When it comes to investing in administrative bodies with other faiths in minority countries, in countries where Muslims are in minority, specifically because we have actually more in common today than ever before, and we have a lot of common goals of preserving parts of our tradition compared to before. And one of the reasons administrative bodies are so important is because they allow coordination on common goals. They allow efficient transmission of knowledge. Because, for example, if someone from, let's say, one Muslim school learns an efficient way to combat a particular spiritual illness or a particular problem in the community, this transmission of knowledge can happen very efficiently within administrative bodies. Moreover, there's easier ways of collaboration when you have administrative bodies. So what we call the collective action problem is more easily surpassed or traversed. Similarly, coordination problems are more easily traversed. I also think that will make it easier to emphasize the commonalities we have as an ummah. And then number one, as the ummah of the Prophet Muhammad, but also as followers of Abrahamic faiths and as followers of tradition, because in reality, all traditions are currently being challenged, and challenged very brutally and unfairly, I think. And so it's important to have these coordination bodies. And these coordination bodies, I believe, again, there are plenty of economies of scale in investing in them. It's an unexplored, I think, investment opportunity, and somebody should make it if they have the money.
Sidi Yahya, what do you think about these? If I could jump right back in, you brought up this issue of bureaucracy and scale and things like that. What do you think about all these different kinds of educational institutions that exist today that are modular, that are non-traditional, virtual? Like Khan Academy is is the prime example. And actually, in this discussion I was just referencing, I was pleading with some of the utopianists, and others to say, give us a project that we can fund. Like, give us an actual project. We can go to development agencies, we can raise funding for it. Give us something that has scale and impact. And they couldn't answer. The utopianists couldn't answer. But one of the pragmatists said, just translate Khan Academy videos. Make Khan Academy videos available, in our countries and in different parts of the world, and make it widely accessible and user friendly. Do you think that the virtual educational models can achieve some of the same goals that we're striving for?
I certainly do. And I think that eventually, so what's happening is that traditional, I shouldn't call it traditional, let's say conventional education systems, since, let's say, they really start a long time ago, but they were particularly normalized and highly invested in since the beginning of the 20th century, right? The 20th century, the opening of the 20th century is the spread of public schooling around the world, right? Because of the creation of nation states around the world and so on and so forth, centralization of the state, etc. Of course, in the West, it has a much longer history, but I'm specifically talking about the internationalization of conventional schooling. I think that system has very strong special interests associated with it. So, for example, academics have a very strong interest in preserving conventional education systems like universities, despite the fact that it's not the best way, for example, to transmit some knowledge or all knowledge, right? It's very expensive and the prices continue to increase and so on and so forth. So now with the emergence of parallel institutions that are doing a much better job, they're more efficient, they're more cost efficient, most importantly for students, you're going to see a lot of resistance. And I don't think this resistance will disappear in the next couple of decades. But I do think as a result of this resistance, the world is a pragmatic world. When Google and other corporations or other business owners or any employer recognizes that these people are just as competent, with time, they will start to employ them equally. And with time, students or prospective students will say, why would I choose a so-called conventional education when I can get the same knowledge out of it in a cheaper way? And so I believe that 1-year certificates, 1-year modular education programs will continue to probably be more and more popular, to the point where they will eventually, I think, challenge conventional education. Probably not anytime soon, because of the strong, think of it as an incestuous relationship between education and the state. Excuse me for using that language, but it's true. There's a very strong relationship between government and schooling, and I think it's not going to disappear anytime soon. But I do think it's going to get better, and hopefully education will continue with these challenges, will be more efficient and more accessible to students in less ridiculously expensive and nepotistic ways.
No, that's great. No, thank you. And I do think that kind of modular approach helps. I know Medina Institute provides courses like that, and if anybody's interested in studying sort of policy and development type of issues, policy around humanitarian care and charity and development. If anybody's interested in that, I do run a 1-year certificate program at Indiana University that focuses on Muslim issues in this area. So I'm happy to provide some information about that. Dr. Brada, on the same question, just about scalability, virtual learning, and things like that, the concepts that you were talking about in both of your responses earlier about tazkiyah and tarbiyah, and then also thinking about those kind of critical gaps that need to be filled. What do you think about virtual learning and sort of this distance learning model that's out there? Do you think it's possible, to achieve some of these goals that we're outlining, with this technology that exists today?
Yeah, first of all, I agree with our brother Yahya Shani. Mostly what I said, I think it's very relevant, and of course he knows that field much better than I do. So I can just share a bit of my insights in the topic. I think that we are in a crossroads now worldwide in terms of education. Also because of the system mostly, but also the content. And more people want to value a holistic approach to knowledge. And the holistic approach to knowledge is not easy to define because it goes totally in contradiction with what has been developed these last decades, not to say centuries, of partialistic approach to knowledge. And I think that we are going to a new way to approach the knowledge in a more holistic way, not only within Muslim environments, but even in non-Muslim traditions. There are quite of the same expectations of reviewing the link with the knowledge, the utility of it, the purpose of having knowledge, what do we do with that, and the purpose of life in general. So it seems to be crossroads, and we don't know how it will evolve, of course, but that would be a new step for Muslims to have a proactive role in that. As before, we spoke about the epistemology. I think epistemology, not a lot of people want to discuss it, but it's totally fundamental now at the time, because it will give the color of all approach of knowledge we want to develop. Epistemology is the foundation in which we can build that. And that said, yes, talking more about Islamic studies, I think also it's very important to link the principles, the usul of Islam, and also the empirical approach to knowledge, and to try to link both, which now there are a few institutes which promote this kind of knowledge, because even in the classical tradition of Islamic studies, it was the case before. The fiqh was embedded in the context, of course, and now in the last century we tend to forget that aspect, and I think that more programs will give a higher value of that approach as well. But yes, for the virtual online teaching, I think the tool has its value, of course, and everybody acknowledges it today. But at the same time, we don't have to forget the tarbiyah and tazkiyah aspect, which means direct human relations, I think, also. And a danger would be to forget that dimension, that human dimension, and to just to develop some programs or study programs online, or like content and nothing else, would have a very different impact of what we want as a holistic approach to knowledge, where the human dimension has to be central. I think it's a danger we have to be aware of.
Yeah. I mean, I just, having taught my own courses over the last couple of years online, it's hard enough, to be frank, in today's world, even in person, it's hard to sort of achieve some of the educational goals that we have, because as you all have said, if you go back to tarbiyah itself, what does the word mean? It comes from Rabb. It means to kind of lord over. Okay. But what does that mean? For the Arabic speakers, how do you say, Yahya, how do you say jelly or jam?
Marabba.
Marabba. Okay. Marabba. What does that mean? It means to churn, to cook, to curate. Okay. Jelly, how do you make it? You have to cook it. right? You have to cook it, and it has to slowly simmer, has to break apart and then congeal, and you add a little bit here or there. But it, the fruit doesn't become jelly until it goes through this process. And we talk so much in Islamic tradition about, adab, abul al-talab, right? So like you have to learn to curate your body, your comportment. And it's very hard to do this in person in today's age. Like if I was teaching at a commuter college, mostly commuter college, not community, university, Georgia State University, that was in the heart of Atlanta. And my students are working, they have families, they have lives, and they're driving in and out of the city. And now education became like a job, you go and you complete it and everything like this. And so this whole connection to the self is gone, To quote one of my favorite authors, there's a Iranian scholar from the 50s, 60s. His name was Jalal Ali Ahmad. He wrote a number of critical treatises about education, about society, things like this. And in his lament about modern education, and think he's talking about in the 50s and the 60s, okay? He says, the university degree today is nothing more than a certificate of employability. Mm. And if you really think about it, I actually talked to my students about this. I said, this is a sad state, but we're no longer dealing with educatory, and like the kind of ideals of what education was. We're dealing with giving you a degree so you can go to an employer and say, I can complete a job. I'm responsible. This is what the university degree symbolizes today. So I asked you guys the questions about the virtual learning. We understand that there are some advantages, there's some advantages to it, especially in terms of connectivity and content distribution, really unprecedented new opportunities. However, it is extremely hard to imagine that we can achieve some of the goals that we want to in that context, because it's even hard in person today. So thank you both for your comments. It's been great learning from you. We're gonna keep going about 15, 20 minutes or so, inshallah. But I wanted to invite our other panelists and guests to weigh in on some of these conversations. And I'd love, sorry to put you on the spot, Ustadha Intisar, but I'd love to hear from you about some of the discussion that we've had so far. If you'd like to weigh in on anything that we've said so far, please take it, in any direction you'd like to. We'd love to hear your opinion.
Okay, that was really interesting listening to all of you guys speaking about the education and where it is or where we are nowadays. And then I just want to back what Dr. Broder was mentioning about leading by example. I think this is what he was alluding to when he was talking about the teacher as a leader. And this is again, and I feel like I'm really inspired because now I can take all these, this discussion and all these ideas discussed here, and I can also implement it in our paper, which is Ihsan and Tazkiyatun Nafs as a teaching philosophy. So talking about leading by example, and when Doctor was saying that teachers are becoming just teachers, transmitting knowledge, not really leading by example, and their students find like sort of this not being, because what the teacher is teaching is basically doing. So and I'm just, when you were talking about this, actually what came to my mind is that the example of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if we can just mention that. And then he always, that was his philosophy and his methodology in teaching his companions, is always lead by example. And then he was actually just telling them, khayrukum, like for example, if I just mentioned this, like khayrukum khayrukum li ahli wa ana khayrukum li ahli. He never taught them anything that he never implied himself. So he was telling them that the best of you is the best to their families, and I am the best to my family, basically in the service of my family or my spouse. And then he was also sort of, when also now talking about the teaching methodology and the different teaching methods and being accommodating for your learners so that you can achieve sort of, or the concept of maintain the concept of social justice, knowing that your students all come from different cultural backgrounds. So the accommodating is part of it, is that you sort of align whatever activities and your teaching methods so that you can accommodate for that. Now, I also remembered something when doctor was mentioning this, again, another hadith where Rasulullah was encouraging his companions and saying, by saying, خَاطِبُ النَّاسَ عَلَى قَدْرِ عُقُولِهِمْ, means like teach or preach to people according to their level of understanding. And this is, again, a very important concept that we tend to ignore, just thinking that of the content and how much we should cover. So we are sacrificing or removing the humanitarian aspect of teaching. Again, when talking about virtual teaching and learning, and I completely understand, especially talking about teaching languages. So imagine if you are talking about philosophy and all these aspects of science that you are teaching. So imagine if you are teaching language where you really need to communicate and interact with the students. So to have sort of contact classes for the students to have this understanding of the language. So what I'm saying, we also need to be aware. I also share the same point of view as Dr. Proder, that we need to be aware of just moving completely entirely into virtual teaching, because for me, the thread is that we are already far from thinking of each other as humans, supporting each other. So imagine if we rely heavily on this. This means that we are adding to what? Salt to the injury. We are even making it even worse by making everything virtual. And then the other thing that I also noticed, and I think that you answered the question that you asked me, Dr. Yahya, or Brother Yahya, when you asked me about how can the concept of ihsan be implemented when we are talking about physical sciences. You said it yourself, like the concept of what is good and what is bad applies to all sciences, whether it's social, physical. So the only way for you to know what is good and what is bad is that if you really try and learn the basic or the principles of the deen, and then you are also talking again, alluding to the concept of ihsan and tazkiyatun nafs, the concept of muraqaba and muhasaba, and being all the time God conscious. So these are actually things, and the spiral, of course, relationship, that was really something, at least a new concept for me as well, which I really appreciate. So thank you.
Thank you, Ustada. I don't know if our colleague Ahmed is still with us. If you're on, feel free to jump in if you have any comments or questions. I think you're on mute, Sidi.
Yes, I will. I want to thank you for this great discussion. And as you mentioned about Georgia State as a commuter college, you had students who had difficulty balancing their life between work and school, working very hard and also going to classes. It reminded me of one of my students last semester telling me, what is the point of studying Arabic? A student who's Muslim from an Arabic speaking family, but okay, what is this going to do to me or help me in the job market? So as you mentioned, with the great quote you mentioned for the scholar, I remember you said Jalal Ahmed or
Ale Ahmed.
Ale Ahmed. So it's a certificate for employment. So his question basically, this is what it is. What is learning Arabic going to do for me or help me in the job market? Even though I have heritage connection to it, I have family connections, religion, but okay, how is this going to help me to get a job? I mentioned many reasons that don't really necessarily include a job, but like, okay, but then I can just go have a spend summer vacation in an Arabic speaking country and get some Arabic, and that's it. So that's, I guess, the dilemma that we're facing now. So that's something I like.
Yeah, I think this is fascinating on the language issue. I've noticed this also with my own children that are just in middle school now. I ask them what language they want to study, and they always refer to this. They say, well, I'm not going to work in this other country, or I'm never really going to use this language. And it's fascinating to think that, there was a time, I hope it's still there, where people learn languages just for the discovery, right? Because when you learn a language if you learn concepts and ideas in another language, it's not just that you're learning that information, but you're actually questioning your own information as well. There's an interrogation there. And that's what that's what the beauty of knowledge is. And that's what the beauty of learning is that it moves the furniture in your room around, you know what I mean? And it changes things. It gives you new decorations. It gives you new perspectives. Our beloved Shaykh was just telling us about just when we were sitting with him recently, was telling us about a poem, a great poet that was writing a couplet, one line in Persian and one line in Arabic, right? And making the rhyme scheme work and everything like this. And, you think about that, the kind of polymaths that we had and the kind of tradition that we had, subhanAllah, So it's a real lament. But I wanted to just open up the conversation. Are there questions that you all have for each other? Sidi Yahya, Dr. Brodart, any questions that you have for each other, if there's anything that you'd like to follow up on? And if you don't, then I'd like to ask a question. We've been talking at the kind of theoretical and conceptual level for some time, and so this is for anybody in the group. Can you give me an example of a program that you've seen, whether it's in the Muslim world or otherwise, that you just feel is really, really effective from an education and leadership development point of view? Something that you looked at and you said, wow, that's moving in the right direction. We should really sort of tweak this or scale this, or that's something that I can hold on to. Anything that you admire. I'd love to hear the concrete examples that are there, so that we recognize that we are speaking in the abstract, but people are doing great work around the world, and we want to really uplift and highlight some of those cases if and when they're available.
Maybe if I can speak a bit, I don't know if I answer your question, but because I don't have only one example, but
yeah, you have many, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I got experiences in very diverse settings, and one of my best experiences in terms of education were in Yemen and Mauritania. In Yemen, in Tarim, with the well-known Dar al-Mustafa school, or in Mauritania in very similar settings in terms of Islamic tradition. And what I gained from that experience was mostly the human education, because what you learned, you feel you learned it in the daily life with the people. They educate yourself not in terms of external knowledge, but also internally. And I think that's what we talked about before, with this holistic approach to knowledge and this tarbiyah, tazkiyah approach. Conversely, I also studied in universities in the so-called modern Western system, and I felt that the problem, you learn a lot of things, but you're alone with that, and it's difficult to make sense of it for a lot of people, because there are a lot of contradictions between the knowledge, the kinds of knowledge you can learn. And it drives to a culture of thought, of critical thought, which is good into an extent, but when it's too far away, it can make people very troubled with the life, with the education, because they get various voices, contradictory discourses, which make sense because there is thought behind them. There are argumentation behind. But at the end, you feel lonely with that knowledge and disconnected. And I think the risk here is kind of social schizophrenia, as I like to speak, I don't say that to say that the traditional model is the best, because I think that we have to go ahead and maybe combine both. But that was my short reflection of this very distant and different systems of knowledge and education.
Thank you so much. It brings me back to this point that Sidi Yahya brought up earlier. Can you repeat it, Sidi Yahya, that the quote that you mentioned from Shaykh, that it is the merciful who teaches? What was it in Arabic one more time?
It's from Surah Al-Rahman. Al-Rahman allama al-Quran.
Yeah, Ar-Rahman alam al-Quran. And so if we think about this, I want to maybe try to tie this back a little bit together. Dr. Brodar, you mentioned that there's a kind of schizophrenia that can happen with modern epistemology, right? And there's also a schizophrenia that can happen if we're too insular in our traditional education, right? And we juxtapose it, there's a gap with the reality. I have to say that as somebody who studied Islamic studies formerly within the university system, within the Western university system, which is an Orientalist system, okay? And they treat, astaghfirullah, they treat our deen like an archaeological site. This is the best way to think about it. And it's not just our deen. I mean, all religions and all human history, they treat it like an archaeological excavation, that they just tear things up. It's like Nietzsche said, they take hammers to books, okay? And so they chop things up. And I have to say that I had been on this, kind of quest, in different madahibs and manahij and just kind of different, approaches to spiritual development. And it wasn't until around 2006, and this was at a time where I was past coursework. I was really getting into the work. And I have to say that it took a toll on my iman, okay? It really took a toll on my iman, because you had to approach this thing that we love and this thing that we cherish, this thing that we hold as sacred. I had to treat it like an archaeological site. And it wasn't until I got to meet, our beloved Sayyid Shaykh, that to ground our knowledge in a relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in the precedent of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to ground our learning and our commitment in that sense allows you to overcome any epistemological challenges, any informational challenges, any philosophical, theoretical challenges that might exist, dissolve in the wake of love and mercy of knowledge. And so I wanted to kind of bring that, bring that point back and say thank you to all of the panelists for, for your ability, to have this discussion, to join us from all different parts of the world. I know that we're all scattered around in different places. And I also wanted to, just again, thank you sincerely for that. And I hope that this is really the one, the first of many such discussions that we can bring together our minds in the Medina Institute family and start to engage others as well on these conversations. I want to say thank you as well to the organizers, put a lot of hard work into this. We had a couple of folks who had to step out because some of them contracted the COVID and also had some other health and family issues where they couldn't join us. And I wanted to just take a moment now to welcome our beloved Shaykh Dr. Mohammed Ninowy. Shaykh, thank you so much for joining us. I have spent many years introducing Shaykh, and every time I can't introduce him. And so everybody just please forgive me. Shaykh, thank you so much for joining us. And we'd love to hear from you just a little bit around the topics of education and leadership. We've been discussing this morning concepts around tarbiyah, tazkiyah, how they differ from ta'aleem, how they integrate with ta'aleem. We've talked a little bit about what these mean for leadership and what the knowledge really means in our world today in terms of integrating it with the practical worldly affairs, having a rich spiritual tradition, but not sort of calcifying that tradition either, and not hiding that tradition from reality. And so these are some of the themes that we've been discussing for the last few hours. We'd love to hear your take on them, inshallah.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum, Dr. Abbas. All of you, Dr. Brother, very nice to hear from all of you. Actually, it was, I didn't hear everything, but what I heard was great. I'm honored and humbled to be with you and amongst you here today. As you all know, I mean, you've all touched base on it in one way or another. We have this faith brought us something definitive and something speculative. The definitive is definitive, and the definitive you'll find it in the Quran and the definitive Sunnah. You will not find contradictions to it, meaning contradictions with sciences, contradictions with things, and that's the base of our faith. Then you go to the speculative, and that's where the scholars then go and apply their their knowledge and all that, and see which is really prophetic from that which is not. That comes to, obviously, you see then the prophetic tradition of taking the knowledge, continuation from the chain of the prophets, working the knowledge, content, context, application, innovation, meaning here ijtihad in a way, if you want to call it. When it comes to tazkiyah, obviously, you see the difference between the association and actual suluk. Association versus dhakir. Not everyone who's associated with tazkiyah is necessarily a dhakir. One who is present and conscientious of Allah Ta'ala in their thoughts and their words and in their actions. So again, we come to the point that association does not necessarily lead to salvation, while it is a great barakah. So we can try to sort out all these things together and come to the point that at the end of the day, and when we all pass from this world to the next, what matters is the actual knowledge that was a realization, and what matters is the actual knowledge, the actual tazkiyah that was transformation, so that one becomes Muhammadi at the end of the day. And that's the whole point of our whole existence in the sense of an institute, is that one becomes applying the Quran and the Sunnah fikran wa qawlan wa amalan until one becomes Muhammadi. And one then is always in observation of Allah Azza wa Jal, and in observation of the Muhammadan khuluq, of the Muhammadan being, of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself in that sense, until one little by little improves themselves, and that takes usually years, decades, etc. I want to thank all of you and thank anyone who is watching and who will be seeing this. May Allah Azza wa Jal bring us all together, bring all the hearts together. May Allah unite us all on that which is good, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala use us all as instruments and reward us for the things that He facilitated for us to do good, and forgive us for the things where we failed or made mistakes. Jazakumullahu ta'ala khair al-jaza. And I want to thank especially the Medina USA family. All of you, it wouldn't have happened without your efforts after Allah Azza wa Jal's blessings. Jazakumullahu ta'ala khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam, Shaykh. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, mashallah. It's always nice to hear from Shaykh. He's very generous to join us. He's traveling now, and so it just shows again some of what we discussed. So even in the face of the virtual connections and the lack of, sort of human interaction there, we still have the opportunity to join one another. And so, alhamdulillah for all of these blessings, and alhamdulillah for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowing us to have the privilege to work on these issues. And as Allah subhanahu, as Shaykh said, it is our efforts after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessings and permissions to allow us to do this work. So we're thankful for these things. I wanted to, before we close out, just Sidi Asad, are you on the line? I just want to let you give a formal closeout. If you have any other announcements for Medina Institute, close us in dua, inshallah.
So I'll leave the dua up to you.
No, Sidi, you're the dua guy.
No, actually, I believe if say the Shaykh is still with us, we can request him to make the dua. But just wanted to, on behalf of Medina Institute, once again formally thank all of the panelists, the participants, everyone who presented, and everyone who took part in organizing this. Alhamdulillah. Just wanted to thank everybody formally, as well as everybody who tuned in and listened. We're very grateful for everyone's participation, and inshallah, this is hopefully a start of something that will continue, inshallah, and grow from here. So if Sayyidi Shaykh is still with us, inshallah, if, you can lead us in dua.
I think he's signed out, and I think he did. I think he did close us in dua as he was leaving us. And so maybe with that, nobody would want to follow that. So inshallah, we'll just say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Please be in touch with the Medina Institute family if you need anything, and we look forward to more conversations soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair. Wa alaikum salam.